My name is Kathleen, 32 years old, and I work in financial risk management where everything is measured by cost exposure and the return attached to a commitment. I have always lived independently, paid my own way, and covered bills without help, yet in my family, that independence turned into a trap. I became the person who solved emergencies, handled overdue balances, and provided coverage whenever someone refused to handle their personal obligations. During our most recent argument, my father leaned toward me, stared without hesitation, and said, "You are replaceable. Do not forget that." My mother stood beside him, laughing under her breath, as if the statement were obvious. That sentence was not a joke. He said it while asking for a larger loan than anything he had requested before. He treated support like a permanent duty and treated me like a financial product he could withdraw from at any time. I listened without reacting. Then I thought about every monthly charge tied to my accounts. I paid for a one-bedroom apartment they occupied. I held the lease on a vehicle they used. I carried insurance for both of them. I paid phone plans and handled credit usage they never reviewed. They used those benefits freely because they believed my income existed to compensate for their choices, never their responsibility. If I am supposedly replaceable, then the benefits attached to my name are replaceable as well. Respect is a requirement in finance. If value is denied, the investment ends. Before we continue, tell me what time it is, where you are, and which city you are watching from, because I want to know how far this story has traveled. What would you do if someone treated you like a replaceable bank account? It began when Dad told me he needed temporary help after losing the job he held for 2 decades. At first, I accepted that request with very little hesitation because the explanation sounded reasonable. He said he needed support while preparing to search for new work, and I believed that a short interruption would eventually settle into a sustainable plan. Instead of updating me on interviews or professional steps, he created a routine where every conversation involved an implied request for bills to be carried by someone else. He told me the market was unfair for people his age, and he implied that employers discriminated against older applicants, which positioned me as the person who had to absorb household expenses without any reference to a future deadline. The concern turned into expectation, and expectation turned into a permanent role assignment he never discussed directly, because he believed that biological connection eliminated the need for negotiation. Mom participated from a different angle because she did not request employment or propose a path toward self-reliance. She told me that money was a symbol of selfishness, and she said that a daughter who focused on income lacked compassion. Whenever I mentioned predictable limits in my own budget, she implied that I valued strangers above my own blood. She has not paid a household bill in years yet. She repeats the claim that moral duty requires children to contribute indefinitely. When I ask her what contribution she handles, she shifts the conversation into judgment. She says that I am obsessed with numbers, and she acts as if the existence of a salary obligates its distribution. That belief allowed her to avoid personal planning because any gap in their household would be redirected toward my paycheck. My brother Kyle helped reinforce that structure by allowing me to sign for insurance policies and device accounts. He told me that premiums did not matter because family unity required shared resources. He said adulthood did not eliminate collective service, and he spoke about responsibility as if it meant financial sponsorship rather than independence. When I asked him to transfer a policy into his own name, he said that I was acting like a landlord. He argued that siblings were supposed to help each other, but his version of help only moved in one direction. He used family language to avoid financial autonomy, and he treated coverage as an entitlement that arrived without review. Dad relied on a bigger narrative. He said that parents invest in children, therefore children must return those investments without limitation. He never recognized that adulthood contains separate financial obligations, and he said that support should be handled without calculations or projections. For him, a bill is simply something that appears, and payment is a requirement managed by whoever has income. He elevated the language of sacrifice whenever I mentioned boundaries, and he connected biological authority to economic control. He did not want a loan that could be repaid. He wanted a lender who would never mention repayment because the relationship itself would be used as collateral. I began to realize that they were not asking for help. They were designing a structure where I would operate as long-term assistants. Every increase in their demand appeared with a decrease in respect for the source providing that demand. Dad stopped acknowledging that I held a career that required effort. He said my generation had easy opportunities, and he dismissed the professional requirements that positioned me for employment. Mom treated my budget reviews as a sign of arrogance. Kyle described responsibility as greed. I occupied the role of provider, but the provider was not permitted to ask questions about cost. What disturbed me most was the belief that my identity should be defined by distribution. I was a conduit rather than a participant. They did not ask about stress or planning. They did not describe timelines or personal adjustments. If a cost appeared, it became my issue. If a late notice appeared, I handled it. They shaped a philosophy where entitlement replaced appreciation. Eventually, I understood that they did not want support. They wanted a permanent subsidy with no expiration, no negotiation, and no acknowledgement of the labor required to maintain it. The next morning, I took a personal day from work so I could review everything that was legally under my name. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my banking app pulled up because I wanted a clear view of the account's automatic withdrawals authorized users and every subscription tied to me. It felt strange to treat my family like a risk assessment, yet that was exactly what I intended to do. The moment Dad said I was replaceable, he unknowingly gave me permission to reconsider every financial structure that kept him comfortable at my expense. I did not feel emotional about it. I felt rational. I wanted a baseline of truth before any reaction from them interfered. I started with the credit cards because they were the easiest to modify. Mom and Dad each had cards with their names printed on them, and Kyle had a supplementary card because he once convinced me that sharing a plan was cheaper. I opened the card management page and removed their access. None of them would receive notifications because the app only contacted the primary cardholder. I locked every card that did not belong to me, and the system required only 2 clicks for each action. It astonished me how quickly dependency could be undone when the person paying the bill stopped authorizing it. After the credit cards, I checked the joint checking account that I had opened for emergencies. My money funded every deposit in that account, and they withdrew from it whenever they felt stressed or inconvenienced. I moved the entire balance back into my personal account and left the joint account active with $0 because the bank required a minimum to close it and I wanted a clean exit instead of a sentimental conversation. I opened a new personal account with 2-factor authentication so that nothing linked back to the shared credentials. Next was the phone plan. The family plan was under my name and the carrier required a signature to remove users. I called the customer service line and asked for a complete separation. The representative informed me that each removed line would need to establish an individual contract with a credit check and a market rate. I approved the change and paid the final cycle for the current month. After that, each user would be responsible for billing replacement devices, upgrades, and data usage. It was not revenge. It was standard practice for adults in the United States. The auto insurance followed a similar structure. The policy included Dad's truck, Mom's compact car, and Kyle's sedan, because Kyle once failed a credit inquiry. I asked to remove their vehicles and maintain only my own. The representative warned me that premiums would adjust once the multi-car discount dropped. I accepted the change because the financial argument for keeping them on my policy had disappeared. The insurer emailed me PDFs confirming that their vehicles were no longer protected under my account. Health insurance was more complicated because it involved legal regulations. Mom and Dad were still eligible for subsidized programs based on their income, and Kyle had access to employer-sponsored coverage but avoided enrolling. I contacted the provider and asked to terminate dependent coverage. The representative explained the enrollment deadlines, special exemptions, and state-based exchanges. I submitted the removal forms electronically and scheduled a confirmation call for verification. It felt like I was following a compliance checklist rather than cutting off relatives. By midday, I paused and reviewed my progress. Every action aligned with a single principle: adults manage their own liabilities. None of the changes were vengeful. None of them were violent. They were administrative corrections that established boundaries. I had spent years believing that I was obligated to subsidize a lifestyle that they refused to afford. Dad called it loyalty. Mom called it love. Kyle called it teamwork. I began to understand that their vocabulary was a disguise for dependency. I reopened my laptop and drafted a list of subscription services that were tied to my cards. Streaming platforms, food delivery memberships, cloud storage, and paid apps were all linked to my billing information. I terminated anything that did not serve me, and I made sure every cancellation generated a receipt. I did not notify anyone because I wanted the transactions to decline naturally. A declined transaction communicates a boundary without a speech. In the late afternoon, I checked my work email to request an additional day off. I planned to visit the leasing office the following morning because the apartment contract listed me as the guarantor. I wanted to understand the legal options regarding early termination and the protocol for notifying occupants. The leasing office required documentation rather than emotion, and I preferred that structure. I closed my laptop because the financial portion of this process was complete. The next step involved physical contracts and signatures, which required an in-person visit. 2 days later, the first payment cards began to decline. I was at my desk reviewing a quarterly report when my phone received a missed call from Mom. She never called during business hours because she preferred texting, so the timing told me something specific had disrupted her routine. I let the call expire because I knew the information would reach me eventually. When the voicemail notification appeared, I waited a moment before listening. Her voice sounded strained, and she asked if my card company was experiencing system errors. She mentioned that she had been at a supermarket checkout, and her card displayed a rejection prompt. She claimed the cashier stared at her with judgment, and she wanted me to handle the situation. Her choice of wording revealed how she perceived my role, as if my name existed to shield her from cost. I sent a short reply explaining that her card was inactive. The response arrived within 1 minute. She asked whether the bank made a mistake, and she insisted that groceries counted as basic needs that I was supposed to cover. I chose not to debate the phrase "supposed to cover." Instead, I wrote that she would need to use her own funds and that a declined transaction is a normal outcome when an account holder changes user access. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear. She asked if I expected her to carry cash as if paying for food, with her own debit card violated natural order. When I repeated that she had financial autonomy, the bubbles disappeared permanently. Later that day, Kyle contacted me through text. He wrote that his gas station pump rejected his card, and he demanded an explanation because he needed to drive across town. He reminded me that fuel prices were high, as though that factor justified his assumption that someone else should absorb his transportation cost. I told him the same thing I told Mom, that his card was inactive, and he could adjust. He replied that I was turning my back on family cooperation. That phrase used to affect me. Now it resembled a slogan designed to excuse dependence. I asked him if cooperation required a single participant providing resources. He did not respond to that message. Dad called during my lunch break. He did not wait for clarification. He said I was humiliating my own parents. He claimed that other children would be proud to support the people who raised them, and he told me my behavior created embarrassment among relatives. I did not engage with the accusation. I told him that adulthood included financial responsibility, and choosing not to pay for someone else's life did not count as humiliation. He asked if I enjoyed watching my parents struggle for pennies. I replied that using personal funds was not synonymous with struggle. He said I should feel ashamed, and I asked him if he felt ashamed when he dismissed my independence. He tried to raise his voice, and I heard frustration tightening his breathing. He said that if the roles were reversed, he would never deny support. I asked him when he last supported anyone without attaching entitlement. He did not answer. Instead, he demanded reinstatement of the cards. I declined and ended the call because the conversation contained no curiosity, only pressure. In the evening, Mom texted a paragraph claiming emotional injury. She said a daughter has a moral obligation to secure her parents' comfort. She wanted me to understand that the world viewed parental care as sacred, and she said I was poisoning our bond. I responded with one sentence: financial support is a choice, not a law. She wrote that my financial boundaries reflected selfishness. I reminded her that self-respect is not selfish. When Kyle contacted me again, he switched tactics. He called the card a misunderstanding and said it would be easier if I restored his access until he figured things out. He wanted convenience, not accountability. I said there would be no restoration. Financial access is not a birthright. The dots appeared for several seconds before he wrote that I was dramatic. I closed the conversation. That night, I reviewed my budget and adjusted nothing because the boundaries were already in place. That weekend, the phone calls came in as if I had triggered a catastrophe. I muted the first ring while reviewing a set of risk projections for a client account. The voicemail arrived a moment later. Dad explained that he had tried calling my cell twice. He sounded determined to be heard, so I waited for the second voicemail before I responded. In the next message, he said he wanted clarification and that he intended to speak with me in a more formal environment if necessary. When I returned his call, he asked for my office number. I asked why he needed it. He said that if I refused to discuss family responsibility in a private context, he would bring the matter to my supervisors and show them the type of daughter they had hired. He described his plan in an ordinary tone as if a threat could register as parental guidance. I told him that my workplace evaluated financial integrity and professional compliance rather than obedience to household expectations. He claimed that ethics applied everywhere. I told him that workplace ethics had nothing to do with maintaining an adult's living expenses. He continued speaking. He said that a daughter who refused support was morally defective and that he would convey that message to anyone who held influence over my advancement. I asked him if he intended to jeopardize my employment because he wanted access to my money. He objected to that phrasing and insisted that he was protecting dignity. I said that contacting an employer to demand discretionary financial support would appear closer to harassment than dignity. He told me that I was dismissing heritage. I told him heritage did not function as collateral. At that point, he ended the call without acknowledging any liability. Kyle reached out later that afternoon. He began with a casual tone. He said that families rely on one another when things feel difficult. He said that inconvenience is temporary and that unity is permanent. He used language that implied benevolence, yet he refused to consider any modification of his own financial behavior. He told me he could secure independence easily, but that it would be unnecessary effort when a sibling already had resources. He repeated that employment required stress and that I could minimize that stress for him. I responded with one question: what prevented him from applying for positions in his field? He said he preferred autonomy. I told him financial autonomy cannot exist without income. He ended the call without acknowledging the contradiction. Mom contacted me in the evening. She said her blood pressure had risen during the week, and she asked if I wanted to watch her health decline. I said I wanted her to register with the insurance program that matched her eligibility. She insisted that the application process felt overwhelming. I said that tens of thousands of adults complete the same forms every year. She said that daughters should handle complexity for their mothers. I said that adults can navigate a system that exists to serve adults. She asked if I believed she deserved discomfort. I said discomfort and responsibility were not identical. Dad called again. He told me my job title compensated me generously, but that he doubted I had earned the position. He said he intended to question whether my credentials represented merit or favoritism. I told him professional advancement is audited. He said that ambition corrupts judgment and that I had forgotten gratitude. I said that withholding financial sponsorship did not remove gratitude from history. He paused before he spoke again. He said he would not hesitate to escalate his concerns. I told him that continued interference with my workplace environment could result in a report because the law protects employees from intimidation that jeopardizes employment security. He rejected the term intimidation. I stated the definition. He asked if I wanted to involve legal representation to settle a domestic disagreement. I said that a boundary remains valid even when relatives dislike the result. A week passed before the financial silence created a new kind of noise in my family. The quiet was not peaceful. It was the accumulation of new bills, unfamiliar applications, and the absence of a credit line they had treated as a normal household fixture. I did not receive angry calls that week. I received questions disguised as emotional messages, and every message circled around the same theme. They wanted an exception. They wanted the past system without acknowledging that the past system was built on my labor. Mom had the first collision with reality because her medical coverage could not continue under my policy. I had already removed her from the plan, and she told me she walked into a clinic expecting to provide the same insurance card I used to hand her. When the receptionist told her the policy was no longer valid, she called me in confusion. She said that the request to pay out of pocket felt unfair because she believed adult children should provide medical stability to their parents. I explained that the United States insurance system does not assign adult children as legal guarantors, and the price she now faced was the price I had been absorbing for years. She told me she would apply for a marketplace plan, but her tone revealed a fear of cost. I reminded her that the cost existed long before the removal. The only difference was that she could now see it. Dad confronted the loan attached to his car next. I had allowed my name on that loan when he refused to accept a higher interest rate tied to his credit history. Removing my support meant he either had to refinance at his actual score or sell the vehicle. He asked me whether I understood what dignity meant for a man his age. I told him that dignity and financial transparency are not opposites. A car used beyond one's means is not dignity. It is debt with chrome. He said the bank refused him without a cosigner. I told him the bank simply priced risk. That is not cruelty. That is underwriting. He did not like that explanation and said he would try again. I knew the likely outcome. Either he would accept a smaller vehicle or assume a cost he had avoided for too long. Kyle reacted to a different form of consequence. He walked into a bank and attempted to open a credit line. The institution declined his application because he did not have a credit score. He called me afterward and asked if I knew how humiliating it was to be treated as financially non-existent. I told him that humiliation is the first lesson of adulthood in this country. Without history, there is no approval. Without responsibility, there is no history. He told me that I could remedy that by placing him as an authorized user again. I said that an authorized user teaches nothing about discipline. It only hides the deficit. The phone situation created another layer of tension. Once I dismantled the family plan, each person had to sign new contracts. The promotional pricing evaporated. They lost rollover data and the monthly charge increased. Mom said the new price felt exploitative. I said the price was never low. It was simply distributed through my paycheck. Dad insisted that loyalty should qualify for preferential treatment. I reminded him that telecommunications companies do not provide loyalty awards to families with no direct payment history. During that week, I observed the emotional strategy they used. They rotated moral language, guilt, tradition, and fear. They cycled through medical anxiety and occupational shame. They invoked the word family to imply legal obligation. They described my boundary as abandonment. None of it changed a single bill. The market is indifferent to feelings. The bank does not accept filial piety as collateral. If they wanted stability, they had to participate. The most unexpected outcome was internal rather than financial. I realized that withholding support did not make me unloving. It removed a barrier they used to avoid reality. I did not replace compassion with punishment. I replaced secrecy with clarity. Mom began comparing plans with a neighbor. Dad started researching loan calculators. Kyle looked up secured credit cards. Progress did not arrive through gratitude. It arrived through pressure. By the end of the week, I understood something simple. I was not the villain in a family injury narrative. I was an adult returning what the system always required. Every citizen manages cost. Every household negotiates affordability. My family had pretended that the rules did not apply to them because they applied to me. When I stepped aside, the rules reappeared. Responsibility is not an insult. It is a contract. They could either learn it or continue suffering the price of denial. I had already chosen my side. One late afternoon after work, I stepped out of my office building and saw Mom, Dad, and Kyle waiting near the sidewalk with an expression that resembled urgency rather than affection. The sight did not surprise me because financial pressure usually creates sudden enthusiasm for proximity, and this time they wanted something more substantial than a phone plan or an insurance card. When I approached them, Mom immediately asked if we could walk somewhere private. I told her that the request could be delivered in public because secrecy was the instrument that allowed the old system to survive. Mom started by saying they needed my help with a housing application. She explained that the landlord of a new apartment required income verification and a guarantor due to their credit profiles. She said that my signature would restore stability because the complex was situated in the same standard of living they previously enjoyed. I told her that a guarantor is a financial liability, not a family symbol. The United States rental market evaluates risk through credit and income, and my signature would convert their risk into my personal debt. Mom said that her age should exempt her from paperwork. I replied that exemption is not a financial category. Dad stepped forward and tried a different angle. He said that a daughter who refuses to support her parents will eventually lose her family. He said that loyalty is measured by economic sacrifice. I told him that emotional extortion does not erase credit consequences. A guarantor becomes responsible for rent if the tenants default, and any missed payment damages the guarantor's credit score. I told him that damaged credit affects mortgage rates, auto financing, and employment background checks. I reminded him that I work in a field where financial credibility is not optional. Mom attempted another justification. She said that the building accepted pets and was located near a grocery store they liked. I pointed out that convenience is not a legal requirement. The rental contract requires income, not nostalgia. She said that she could repay me eventually. I asked her to define eventually. She did not provide a number because numbers end fantasies. Dad's tone shifted into condescension. He suggested that I was exaggerating the credit system to avoid responsibility. I told him that avoiding responsibility is precisely what created the current problem. For years, their expenses sat under my name, and they treated the absence of a bill as proof that the bill did not exist. A guarantor contract would expand that delusion into a legal document. He said that I was heartless for refusing. I said that informed consent is not heartlessness. It is adulthood. Kyle interrupted and directed the conversation toward himself. He said that if I guaranteed the lease, it would help him too, because it would keep the family together. He said he still needed assistance with gas and phone expenses. I asked him whether he intended to build independent credit, or whether he intended to attach himself to me indefinitely. He said that siblings support each other. I told him that support without effort becomes dependency, and dependency without accountability becomes extraction. He asked whether I could guarantee at least 1 year. I said that 1 year is sufficient to ruin a credit score. Dad escalated again. He said that my refusal humiliates him as a father because he should not have to negotiate with his daughter in public. I told him that humiliation resides in the gap between expectation and capacity. If he could satisfy the landlord's requirements, there would be no negotiation. The market is impartial. It does not consider parental pride. The conversation ended when I established the final boundary. I told them that future requests for financial assistance must arrive through email because written communication protects clarity, establishes documentation, and discourages psychological manipulation. I said that I would not discuss money in parking lots, sidewalks, or offices. The legal system recognizes email trails. It does not recognize hallway arguments. Mom asked whether I would reconsider if she demonstrated good faith. I told her that reconsideration implies negotiation, and there is nothing to negotiate. My credit is not collateral for their lifestyle. Dad muttered something about disowning me. I told him that family cannot be defined by loan structures. If love depends on credit access, it is a transaction. If loyalty depends on signatures, it is debt collection. They walked away with disappointment. I walked to my car with clarity. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are risk management. I no longer subsidize denial. A few months passed, and the financial distance produced a relational distance that did not require raised voices or emotional theater. The silence between us came from logistics, not sentiment. When money stops traveling in one direction, every form of communication becomes honest by default. Without subsidized expenses, Mom and Dad no longer evaluated life through preference. They evaluated it through invoices. I learned from a brief update that they abandoned their pursuit of upscale housing. Instead of trying to force their way into a complex that demanded credit standards they could not satisfy, they settled into temporary lodging where payments operated on a weekly basis. A motel room is not a tragedy, although they treated it as punishment rather than math. In the United States housing structure, weekly rent offers flexibility for people with limited documentation and inconsistent income. Flexibility became their new dignity. A month later, they shifted into a smaller apartment. The unit did not include the aesthetic comforts they used to mention, yet it aligned with the number on their bank statements. I never criticized the downgrade. I did the opposite. Living within capacity is a mark of adulthood, and adulthood does not require applause. It requires arithmetic. Kyle encountered a different consequence. Support ended, so he had to enter a labor market that did not accept personal narratives. He took a position at a low wage because that was the only offer available without a credit history, without savings, and without a resume that reflected consistency. Wage disappointment is common among people who romanticize assistance. Earning a small paycheck taught him something my generosity never achieved. He learned the price of gasoline when he stopped expecting me to fund it. I did not observe his process directly. I heard fragments through social media and occasional texts that attempted neutrality. The impressive part was not his tone. It was the effort. The American economic model rewards participation even when participation appears unremarkable. Dad returned to the workforce because employment replaced anger. The market did not care about his ego or his age. It cared about whether he could complete tasks in exchange for compensation. He stopped blaming me because the economy does not respond to accusations. A paycheck created perspective. He redirected his energy toward survival, and survival is incompatible with denial. Mom learned something parallel. She handled her own insurance paperwork instead of complaining about bureaucracy. Insurance enrollment is a tedious ritual, yet she completed it because the alternative involved penalties. Responsibility is not a revelation. It is simply the moment when excuses expire. During that period, I concentrated on my career with a clarity I did not anticipate. Removing financial pressure created emotional space. I stopped feeling guilty for enforcing boundaries because the results proved their necessity. Cutting support did not destroy anyone. It forced individual autonomy. The outcome did not resemble a family reunion yet, it resembled functional economics. No reconciliation occurred. No one requested a holiday gathering. No one pretended that financial independence equals rejection. We simply moved in separate trajectories. Emotion did not dominate structure. Structure dominated emotion. In American culture, adulthood often concludes the sentimental illusion that family must operate as a shared bank account. I did not grieve the absence of closeness. Proximity that relies on financial obligation is not closeness, it is dependency. When dependency ends, the relationship either matures or dissolves. Ours dissolved into something realistic. There were no symbolic hugs. There were no emotional apologies. The separation was not violent. It was proportional. I reached a conclusion about value. Love without responsibility is performance. Responsibility without funding is resentment. The cleanest form of affection is distance that protects resources rather than distance that advertises injury. I protected myself, and protection did not require justification. I did not look for evidence of emotional improvement. The evidence appeared through outcome. Bills were paid by the person who owed them. Contracts were signed by the person who used them. Credit resumed its proper path. That was the ending. Not dramatic, just practical. I never waited for appreciation because appreciation is unnecessary. Survival is enough. They survived. I advanced. That was our final alignment. Financial boundaries are not cruelty. They are structural guidance. When people build their own credit, their dignity increases because dignity depends on capability. Cutting assistance does not reject family. It rejects distortion. The healthiest form of loyalty acknowledges limitations and respects risk. I learned that adulthood requires refusal. Refusal preserves stability. Stability creates opportunity. Opportunity generates progress. Thank you for staying through this story and for engaging with a narrative that does not rely on fantasy reconciliation. If you have experienced financial boundaries, controlled assistance, or a transition into independence, share your perspective in the comments. Your insight may help someone who confuses love with obligation. Let the discussion continue with clarity rather than shame.